Hello and welcome to our webinar today on 360-degree feedback best practices. My name is Charles Rogel and I'm the Vice President of Products and Marketing here at DecisionWise. Joining me today is Dan Hoops.
Good morning everyone, or afternoon depending on what part of the country you're in.
Dan recently joined DecisionWise as a senior consultant. He has over 25 years of experience as an HR executive at various companies including L3 Communications, Intuit, Gateway, and Marriott. And he's also coached hundreds of leaders on their 360-degree feedback results and will provide a lot of our color commentary today as we go through our presentation. DecisionWise has been in business now since 1996, and we specialize in conducting 360-degree feedback and then coaching leaders on the results. Our focus is really on helping leaders improve using 360-degree feedback results. This webcast is scheduled for 60 minutes. Everyone's on mute, so if you have questions, please use the question tool to submit them, and we'll address them as we go. The slides and other handouts for the presentation can be downloaded from the handout section of the toolbar. This webcast has been approved for 1 hour of HRCI and SHRM recertification credit. So after the presentation, I'll send you an email that includes activity codes to redeem that free credit, along with links to the slides and other downloads. So Dan, let's first start off by talking about some of the reasons to use 360-degree feedback. And here we could label this slide a few different ways, either the benefits of 360-degree feedback, why we need it, or even how to sell 360s to your organization. And I like that title because a lot of times I've talked to people over the years that are wanting to do 360s, and they're getting a little bit of pushback maybe from senior leadership or some of the managers that they're going to go through. And they're saying, how do I sell this? How do I convince people of the need for 360s who've never done them before? So here are 8 reasons, and we're not going to go through all of them, but I can kind of give you the general scenario of what happens. The manager says, oh, I'm always open to feedback. Anyone can come in my office and talk to me at any time and give me any feedback that they want. But the reality is that most people aren't. Most people are too afraid to really speak up and say something. It's just uncomfortable for the most part. And the other thing that 360s provide, so 360s provide you, number one, kind of a safe place to receive and give feedback. And also, just anecdotal feedback from people a lot of times isn't very comprehensive. And so you really don't get kind of a full picture of your leadership style or skills just through maybe touch points every once in a while. So a 360 is nice because you get really comprehensive feedback about how you're performing in the organization.
Yeah, and what resonates with me when I look at this slide, the most common thing that's occurred with me in the organizations where I've been part of this is it's really, the umbrella of this is, it's all about building the capabilities of the leaders inside the organization. Mm-hmm. Yes, it'll enhance performance, and yes, it's promotes dialogue, and it's a way to create the feedback. But ultimately, the best practices that I've been in the organizations where I have is it's around building the capabilities and helping the leaders get better. If I can focus on development instead of using it as a performance tool, you get much better results, and it becomes a little less fearful as well because managers are like, oh yeah, everybody's got something to develop on. Here's a way for me to be able to do that.
Yeah. And so another item here is we've seen sometimes people will say, oh, we're going to do 360s for this one manager that needs it.
Yeah,
So.
Yeah, and I've seen that, and I always ask them when I've been in my OD roles, it's like, well, why don't we just give them the feedback? Because what's going to happen is that story will then go throughout the organization, and they'll, oh, we're just going to use 360 feedback as a replacement for performance management.
Right.
And that really kind of destroys the confidentiality or the trust that people can use as a development tool.
Yeah, you ruin the reputation of it.
Yeah.
And you can't really use it for what it's meant to. So it's a great tool, and the other thing we always recommend, it's a great way to initiate a coaching program in your organization. So if you're trying to say, hey, we want to provide coaching to our leaders, this is the way to make it happen. And we'll talk more about some other best practices.
Another best practice that comes to mind is if you're trying to establish a baseline of performance and expectations for leaders. So when I worked at Intuit, we used it in every one of our leadership development programs because we were creating a baseline expectation. We had our competencies, we had the behaviors anchored to it. Yeah. So it also help us in our performance management, not in the ratings, but just setting the expectations of what you want from your leaders.
Yeah, this is what we expect. Here are the behaviors that you need to exhibit. which takes us to kind of our next discussion, which is choosing or using the right questions, and kind of how or how to build your competency set, how to really determine what you want to measure for leadership competency. So every organization is unique, and as you mentioned into it, they probably put a lot of effort into developing a set of competencies and behaviors that their managers would live up to. And so when you're conducting a 360, you kind of have a couple choices. One is to build a tool from the ground up based on some competencies that you already have developed within the organization. Or if you haven't done that yet, you can use kind of a standard 360 from a provider out in the market. And so we're showing right now our standard 360 for business leaders that's developed for basically leaders of leaders, managers of managers, so to speak. So it's a little bit more strategic than a supervisor level 360. And it's based on some of the most common competencies and behaviors that we've seen within organizations. In fact, many times when we customize this tool, we might change 10 to 20% of the questions because it's so similar to what other people need in their company. So the first topic really is, when should you customize and when should you use a standard instrument? And the recommendation we have there is, if you're using or going with administering this to a small group of people, it's better just to use what might be more simple or also cost less, to just use a standard 360 tool because it's already built. You have good benchmarking comparisons that you can use, and it's easy to roll out for a group of 10 to 20 managers.
And you don't have to customize.
Yeah.
Yep.
Customizing does take some time and some effort, and if you're going to customize, we usually say do that with if you're going to roll this out to all the leaders in your organization, then it makes sense.
And customizing, it makes sense at times. So the organization I just came from, we were doing 360 for our top 300 leaders literally around the world. So we had operations in 100 different countries. We translated into 9 different languages. We had a very robust competency model, and people were very clear on what it was. It was linked into all of our other HR systems and processes. So it would have felt odd to not use our competencies in the 360s. Yeah. And by the time we got through the 300 people, there was a clear connection of, oh, that's what you want from me as a leader. But to your point, when I was at L3 and we were doing one-off workshops with our senior executives, we didn't want to go through. They were coming from different divisions, and they didn't have a common competency model. So we just did a standard one with those groups of 30 or 40.
Good point. So as you're looking at what questions to use, kind of how to build this, most 360s are constructed based on a competency heading with the behaviors that kind of describe the competency in each bucket. And so we've got decision-making, planning, organization, integrity, and trust. We normally include 4 behaviors with each competency. That's about a good number when people are taking a survey to kind of get their head around. You want to make sure your questions are designed so that they're succinct, they're specific, that they're not too easy to answer, so you don't want everyone getting outstanding on a certain question. That tells you it's kind of a bad question sometimes. And that it really describes the behavior pretty specifically, something that people can observe.
Yeah, and that's really the key part, because you want the behavior so that they can then take action in their action planning.
Yeah.
As soon as they say, well, they're a nice guy, well, what does that mean? Or, this person's kind of a jerk to work for. Well, what is it that they actually do? So if you're going to customize your survey, that's really the key part there, is making sure that the behavioral anchors are actionable and it's clearly defined. Now, some of the advantages of a custom in this is you can use the language for that organization.
Yeah.
The balance of that is they just need to make sure that it's really useful and actionable language.
Another thing I was going to add is you want to make sure that the audience, so your audience is somewhat broad. You've got their manager, direct reports, and peers answering these questions. So you need to make sure that all those groups can observe these behaviors. Yep. Else you're going to get a lot of don't knows on your survey.
Well, you get the don't knows, and then you also go into the feedback. So I've delivered feedback, and I've coached individuals before, and they're like, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
It's like, and that's the last thing you want to have happen when you get in. If your role in HR is to coach a number of managers through the 360, and have the manager come to you and say, well, what does that mean? And you're like, well, why? I don't know. What do you think it means? And it detracts from their ability to really focus and hone on what's important for them.
And that's a good point, because that's one good way to validate your 360 is if you've coached 10 people on it, you will immediately know which questions are problematic and not really working, which competencies maybe need more items to kind of fully describe it better. And so you'll get a good idea if you roll this out and do a few different sessions of how you want to tweak it or maybe change your 360.
Yeah, and you can begin to look at the reliability of your instrument, is it face valid? And so there's a lot of things you can do.
So the other thing that you'll notice here that might be a little different than what you normally see is the scale. We're using a 7-point scale from very poor to outstanding. The reason being, and we'll show you this as we go into the report or sample report, is to get a broader range of feedback. You want to be able to see gaps in perceptions between different rater groups, and using a 7-point scale gives you a greater range. And that leads to some really important conversations as you're coaching people, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
Which I think is really helpful. Again, the last place where I came from, we had a 5-point scale, and as we started to create our internal norm, the challenge was, okay, what's the big difference between a 4.5 and a 4.4?
Yeah.
Right, and you have this benchmark, and then the managers, it kind of groups around essentially a 3-point scale, and there's not a lot of differentiation, and there's not a lot of differentiation in me compared to somebody else. So it's like, well, I guess I just fall to the norm.
Yeah. What
I like about a broader scale is it gives you an opportunity to really differentiate and make some of that contrast.
One thing that's somewhat unique to the 360 I'm showing here to others that you'll see is this derailleur section. So we started using a derailleur section about 13 years ago when working with a client who wanted to include this on their 360. They felt like the 360 wasn't really getting at everything or some of the issues that leaders were, or bad behaviors leaders might be showing. And so we threw this, we put together this, threw together this derailleur section. Actually, we did a lot of research and came up with this derailleur section that measures these different behaviors that undermine a person's success. And so you'll see some pretty common items here like not a team player or micromanager, volatility comes up, closed-mindedness, eager to please. And what happens is you get to see a more balanced story from the feedback. So for example, if someone is really good at results orientation and planning and organization, they might also show a tendency of being a micromanager and a perfectionist. And so a lot of times we see those things play together because it's an overused strength that kind of comes out as a derailleur. Sometimes, and we'll show a sample on an example on our sample report here of another scenario, but really it gives you a better picture of what's going on. Most people don't score very high on these. We see sometimes a some response in some of these areas, and they're not really a surprise to people when they go through it, but it really helps to balance and create a better theme or story around their feedback.
This is a great part. I was coaching a senior vice president of one of our divisions, and I was talking to him about some feedback that he had already received. And he was getting feedback as he took over this division from one of the prior senior vice presidents, and he was told, one of the best things you can do is to be nice. And he said, well, I'm not nice. And what's interesting, you look at these derailleurs and you talk about volatile. Well, he was volatile, drove great results. But you know what happened to him in 6 months after that? What happened? The CEO came down and fired him.
Oh, really?
He did, because it was so against the culture of the organization.
Yeah.
And he knew it. He's like, well, I'm not nice. Well, ultimately, it got you fired.
Right.
And this is just a nice way of validating. It's not a single perspective. Again, it comes from the composite of the individual. It's like, oh yeah, I guess I really better pay attention to that. I can be a high performer, but still lose my job.
Yeah. And it also might kill performance later on down the road if people start leaving the department or whatever.
Absolutely.
The last piece are open-ended questions. So we like to include one about any key deficiencies that show up from the derailleur section. It's kind of a segue to this question 65. And then on question 67 and 68 here, we show two open-ended questions. So greatest strengths and then things this person could do to be more effective. Now, we get into some conversations with clients when we're doing this because they want to include more open-ended questions. They'd like to have one maybe after every behavior, or not behavior, every competency. Or if someone gets a low score, they want an open-ended question to show up and say, hey, why do you give this person a low score on this question? What we find, though, is that two things happen. Number one, it makes your survey really long, and people tend to burn out before they finish it. And if you have a pop-up question when people give low scores, leaders will get high scores then, because people will be tired of answering a question every time they give them a low score. So what happens is we find that most of the feedback, all the good feedback, really gets summarized in these two open-ended questions. and a theme develops there, and it ties into the qualitative or the quantitative results that you get from above. And so we'll show more how that works, but the best practice here is to use 2 or 3 open-ended questions. Don't use too many. And the length of the survey as well, you see we're using 68 here. This takes about 10, maybe 15 minutes to complete, depending upon how much they write in these open-ended sections. And it gives someone some really good comprehensive feedback. If you go too short on a 360, like maybe 30 questions or so, you don't quite get a good rounded view. And if you go too long, you'll burn people out. The idea is you don't want to ask everything possible. You want to get a good set of feedback that you can start with, and about 60 to 70 questions is a good range.
You know, another key reason, at least in my mind, for having limited number of write-ins is that my experience has been that that's usually where the fear comes of somebody being identified.
Yeah.
Because they may use certain words or phrases that are common, and then the person that's getting the report back is like, oh, I know who said that.
Yeah.
So I've known people that have actually changed the way they write or they phrase things because they don't want to be identified in the written section. So again, in my mind, is also be the best practice is limit that so you make people comfortable with the feedback that they're giving, and they don't worry about getting identified.
Great point. I've attached a sample 360 survey in the handouts there. If you'd like to download and see a sample, you can do so. So we'll change gears here and talk about kind of administration best practices. The whole idea here is confidentiality, we mentioned before, is really important. So here's some best practices around rater groups and rater selection. Your standard rater groups I have listed here, you know, supervisor, direct reports, peers, and others. There's 2 groups we sometimes get some pushback from in terms of who actually takes the survey. And that is, you know, do I really have to have the manager take it? You know, managers don't want to do it, and the individual doesn't. You know, why do I have to have the individual take it? To answer the question about the manager taking it, we say absolutely. I mean, that's really their job, is to provide feedback to their direct reports. And that data point is separated on the report. So you see the manager score individually. That's one of the only individual scores besides the self-score that you'll see. And it gives you a good frame of reference about how an individual compares to their manager scores and other people that they work with. When we talk about peers, maybe you don't include all of the peers in this group. And this group sometimes can be a little shaky because, you know, if you work with peers that are remote, you don't get together too often, they don't really see you working regularly, then maybe you don't include all of them or just a few of them. Or you include them but just realize that they don't have the same perspective as other people do. Direct reports, we recommend that you include all of those just to give everyone a fair share, a fair chance to give you feedback. And then the other group is appropriate if you work with other people that don't quite fit into those groups. We usually say if people have been working with you for 3 months or more, include them in the list. Less than 3 months, they might have not seen you perform or, you know, exhibit those behaviors, get a lot of don't know scores, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and in my mind, another great practice around the rater groups is make sure that your number is large enough that you really get good feedback. I don't know how many people I've coached, and on their peers they'll have like 4 people, and they'll have a low score, and it's like, oh, I know who said that. Again, whether it's in the written comments or just in the rater groups, especially if it's a low feedback, they always want to, for some reason, find out who said what.
Right.
And if you have a large enough group in, you know, peers, direct reports, it just gives better feedback, and it also protects the anonymity of the individuals that are going through. And then you can focus as a coach on the feedback versus who said what. And then you say, well, you know, it looks like 5 other people also said the same thing.
Yeah.
Or 10 other people said the same thing. And the other key practice on this rater groups is whether you select friend or foe, because of the anonymity of the feedback, they're honest. I've also coached people that said, oh, I just want to choose my friends. It's like,
what's the point?
What's the point? Well, they'll give you the same feedback because the great thing about a 360 tool is it creates anonymity.
Yeah. And
it creates safety for somebody to give feedback. So if you and I are really good friends, and I don't want to make you feel bad, but this gives me an opportunity to give you some feedback that I think you should really hear, which ties into the rater groups as well.
And this is where some of the fear and anxiety comes in, because people are afraid to say, you know, to have people take pot shots at them, for example, which we don't usually ever see. I think very few times have we ever seen someone that was somewhat malicious or just had malintent when they gave feedback, and we redact those. But the idea here is that people have these perceptions anyway, and it's better for you to know what people think about you than not to. And you can choose what to do with the feedback. You could discount it and say, oh, it's not true, or they don't know me. But at least you know how people are perceiving you.
Yep. It's like the saying, the best change tool you ever need is a mirror.
Yeah.
And that's really what this 360 is it's a mirror into who you really are as a leader. And the leaders that I've worked with through my career really want to know who they are so they can be the best that they can be.
The other thing we'll say here is a lot of people ask, okay, so how many total raters should you have? We recommend between 8 to 20. Most times we see 8 to 12 people show up on a report, and that includes, self-supervisor, 3 or 4 direct reports, maybe 5 or 6, or 3 or 4 peers, 5 or 6 direct reports. Just depends on how large your group is. But we have to have at least, or we recommend, best practice, at least 2 people in that peer group and direct report group, so you get an average score. That's pretty slim. We want more than that.
Yeah, and I would encourage more than that.
So the keys to making your feedback safe, we're going to go through these 5 items here: setting expectations, the report, and rater group size, and whatnot. And these will give you some real good pointers on how you can make people feel safe giving feedback. We get a lot of phone calls here, people whispering in their cubicle saying, hey, I just got a link to take this 360 for my manager. Who are you? What's going on? I just want some confidence in knowing that it's going to be, they won't be identified individually. So here's what you need to do to set expectations. Number 1, who's going through the 360 process? Is it just one group of leaders? Is it going to be all leaders eventually? Who are going to be the raters? Just let people know, because no one wants to be that one guy who's getting a 360 for some reason. And so make sure that they understand who's in that group. Choosing raters is really important. So best practice is really let the individual, the leader that's going through this, choose their own raters with input from their supervisor and maybe HR. So the individual chooses the list, the manager verifies it, maybe adds and deletes some people, and HR checks it as well to make sure there's a good group there. But that gives them some buy-in to the feedback and the results they're getting.
Well, it also gives them a double check of, are they excluding a group where that feedback would be really helpful.
Yeah.
So if they know that there's some tension between them and some other groups and they're purposely not leaving them on, they still would have some good feedback and it'd be a great development opportunity.
Yeah, and that's where your manager has a conversation with them and says, hey, you need to include this guy too, or somebody else. Who's going to see the report? So best practice here the first year when you're doing it, we recommend that it only go to the individual that is receiving the feedback. Now you'll say, well, how is the manager supposed to know what was said and follow up with them? Well, the idea is that the manager then would see the action plan that the individual creates and hold them accountable for that development. Usually most people are going to share the report with their manager anyway, but if you tell them, hey, we're going to keep this confidential, this is your report, you get to look at it, don't worry about it, they feel a lot better about the process.
Yeah, and again, another organization where I work, we created a template for the manager to fill out to help facilitate that conversation with their manager.
Okay.
And then we also gave a template for the manager, because this is the first time either group had done it. It's like, here's how you engage in a conversation when they come and talk about your development plan. So they weren't disclosing the report because we said it's confidential, although the manager line is there, but it just helps facilitate that confidentiality, but then facilitate the quality of conversation as well.
Number 4 is really important. People want to know, it's very important, we'll talk more about coaching, that somebody debrief the results with them, whether it be you and HR or an outside coach or even their manager. We'll talk about some of those options. But explain who's going to do it so they'll know who's going to see the report and coach them on it. And then number 5 is really the big one. What are they expected to do? And this is where we'll talk more about action planning. We say set the requirement that everyone create an action plan or individual development plan based on their feedback. And that's kind of the outcome. That's how you kind of put teeth to the process and hold people accountable for the result.
Just one other thing on item 4, who will debrief the results. I think the best practice for me is that should be a joint conversation between the participants and those that are helping administer the survey. So if there are multiple options inside of the organization, if it's an external, and I feel much more comfortable because, I can be really forthcoming and disclose, that may be, for the first time out of the gate with an organization, just give them options or tell them, no, in HR I'm going to be your coach, and within HR there are 5 individuals, but we really want to keep this in-house. because we can understand and translate the results into the culture a little bit better.
Yeah.
So just that's one of those key decisions is who will debrief and who will I get to debrief with.
So the next one is the rater group size. We touched on this a little bit. You know, the scores are averaged by group. The more raters in a group, the higher the confidentiality, as you were mentioned before, Dan. And the minimum is 2 in each group to receive a breakout. You know, if you only get 1 direct report that responds, usually we'll combine it in with another group or just suppress it. The exception, of course, managers and self-scores are shown individually. That's really a good point of comparison. We'll show that a sample of that on a report. And reminders, we recommend, and people, most leaders should get about 90% participation on their 360 because it's such a small group. So make sure you're sending out reminders. You're giving them about 2 weeks to take the survey. Again, everyone's going to wait until the last day, most likely to take it.
It usually jumps up.
Yeah, and the managers are the worst offenders. They're the ones that take forever to complete it because, of course, they usually have 5 or 10 to do anyway for all their direct reports, and so you'll struggle a little bit with them.
That's very true.
And then here's where I'll kind of give a somewhat biased opinion about whether you should buy a software tool and do it in-house or work with an outside provider like DecisionWise. So the pros here of using an outside provider is that you have higher perceived confidentiality because people know that the data is going to be residing outside of the company and HR is not going to be able to see individual responses. It's easier to administer. Basically, you just give the company the names of the people and they take it from there. And you get a lot of expertise and guidance in terms of how to best run it for your particular population. There's proven survey content that's been used over years and benchmarking comparisons as well. Now, if you're going to do it in-house, you'll have to overcome this hurdle of lower perceived confidentiality because, especially if they don't trust HR or there's a kind of a low trust environment, it'll be difficult. And what you'll find is you get lower participation and higher scores because people are afraid to ding anyone. It can be less expensive, but you need to make sure that you have the resources internally to do it. And you do get complete visibility into what's going on and probably some more flexibility because you can kind of choose how you want to run it and when.
What was interesting about the first time I saw this slide, I had to pause because in my 25 years in organization development, leadership development, I ran 360s in multiple organizations, and I never did it in-house.
Oh, yeah?
I never did it in-house. I always partnered with somebody like a DecisionWise that could create that barrier of anonymity, and I didn't want to get caught in just the minutia of the administration.
Mm-hmm.
So when I saw this first time, it's like, wow, I wonder even who does it in-house, because not that I'm the expert, but in as many organizations as I've been an internal OD guy, I always used an outsourced partner.
Good point. And I've seen people that are successful doing it in-house. They've done it over a number of years, so that trust has been developed, and they also have some expertise with it. They have the right people that can debrief the results, know how to develop a 360, all that kind of stuff. So let's talk about the best practices in reporting the results and kind of how you should display or what you should look for when displaying the results or sharing the results with individuals. So let me switch over here to a sample report. So I'll bring up our sample report, which is pretty similar to most of the reports that you'll see. It's a lot of similar pages or views, you might say, in terms of what you'd find on a 360. Some of the important items here that we'll touch on is this first page about the demographic summary. So understand that when someone takes a 360, they have chosen their raters, or when they're getting their report finally, they might have chosen their rater group about a month before, because it takes about a week to kind of set up the process, 2 weeks to take the survey, maybe it's a week or so before they finally sit down and go through the results. So they might not remember who was chosen to give them feedback, and it's also good to see how many actually participate. So they get a nice refresher here. Oh yeah, I remember I chose these people, and oh, I see someone else, my manager included or something here. But the idea, the conversation you want to have about the raters is, okay, well, do you trust the opinions from these people? Is this a good set of raters? Do you have any problems with anybody on this list? And so this gives you an idea to kind of set the stage where people feel like, yeah, I trust these people. This is going to be some valid feedback I got from people. Because if you don't show this, then it's easy for people to discount some of the bad results they might see and say, oh, well, I'm not sure who this was, so yeah, they forget about it.
And when I'm coaching somebody through a 360, I always ask them why they selected those groups.
Yeah.
Why is it that you had 5 peers, and why those peers? What is it that you're trying to get from that feedback? Yeah, the other good part about this is we don't know who responded, but they can see the total number that did respond,
yeah.
just not the names of the individuals.
Yeah, and that's a good point. So we're not checking or identifying anyone here that did or did not. These are just the original list.
But as a coach, and even when I was in my HR roles, I always wanted to know what was the thinking behind why this group versus other names, and what were you solving for when you were getting those names, and what feedback were you looking for, especially on the other? Were they external clients? Were they people just spread out around the country?
Yeah.
It just helps you as an HR professional kind of help them piece together the story that this begins to tell.
So the next item is kind of a summary page, and so you want to show summary results. Here we're showing the overall score, we call a leadership score, for all the questions, the average score for all the questions put together, and then a breakout for the different competency areas. So remember, each of these competencies has about 4 behavior statements or questions tied into each one. So the average score for each of the competencies is shown. And then the red mark or red indicator we use here is a norm line or a benchmark indicator. This is the average score of everyone that's taken this survey. So you can immediately see, okay, this person's about scoring, average compared to everyone else, which is between good and excellent. We see that that's relatively high because most leaders do a good or excellent job, otherwise they wouldn't be in a leadership position. We've seen people with really low scores, relative, kind of bordering on the average or between fair and average is kind of a really low score on a 360, but most will be between this average and excellence mark, or good and excellent mark. So there's a little bit of difference here. You can see this person's doing great on integrity and trust, customer focus, communication, teamwork, leading others. Lower scores around planning and organization, results orientation, and performance management. So the story that's developing here is that this individual gets along really well with their team. They look up to him or her, and there's some good relationships there, but they might not be the best at getting things done and really performing or delivering results. And so there's kind of a theme there, and that's kind of a point of discussion you have with them when you're coaching. What do you see here? What are some of the overall themes?
And that's really an important coaching point as well. Depending on the organization, if they're a very results-oriented culture, you can already see a conflict that this potentially could create. So the coaching around this is, well, we better, even though it may be minimal, it may be having some career implications about the person's effectiveness to get in and get some results and move up inside the organization if that's what they choose. Yeah,
because you don't need to be off the charts on every single competency. It's usually the ones that are most important for your success that you want to focus on.
Yep.
So most reports as well will have a highest and lowest scores area. So we're showing the 5 highest and 5 lowest scores here, which it provides a little bit more insight compared to the summary results, because here we can see a lot of questions about being open to feedback, environment of openness, cooperation, good relationships appears on these 3 questions. Lowest score is about performance management here in 47, delegation, prioritization, things like that come up on this section.
Another important thing to keep in mind as you're administering the 360 in your organizations is to determine what you want the norm to be.
Yeah.
Do you want it to be an internal norm against everybody that's taken the survey inside of your own company? Or do you want it to be benchmarked against like a DecisionWise database where you're looking at leaders across multiple industries? And I've done both. Last place where I came, we did our internal benchmarks. The challenge was, until we got through enough individuals, there wasn't a norm to benchmark against. Whereas you're looking at, our database has a lot of people in there, you can begin to compare yourself against others.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And we usually say the best practice in terms of benchmarking internally is to have about 30 people take the survey, and then you have enough there to kind of start showing that line. And that's what we recommend because it's more relevant, because a lot of times they'll take this and say, oh, this is everyone that's ever took it. Well, I don't know who any of those people are and how I would compare to them. So sometimes it causes some confusion when you're coaching them. So here's a breakout for the individual questions and the overall competency. And you can see, again, the norm line appears here, the differences in rater groups. And there's a theme here. Again, you can see the peers are providing lower scores on average than any other group. And the individual sometimes provides a lower score than other people as well. And so the discussion here is, okay, well, planning an organization looks like, your peers have scored you the lowest out of all these groups. What's going on there, and then there's a discussion about that.
Yeah, it really becomes, at this point, kind of a mystery to be solved. The term that you used earlier is, what is the story that's being told? You begin to create these hypotheses like, wow, your peer groups seem to be lower all the time. And it becomes a process of asking a lot of questions. What's your reaction to that? And what could be leading to that? And why might there be a big difference between your peers and and your manager?
Yeah, and sometimes they say, well, I just don't work with them very often, or maybe this person is most concerned with their team and doesn't really manage to the group or to the functional responsibilities that they have within that group.
Or it's a dispersed peer group rather than in the same building. They may be spread across the country or the world.
The Deraille section is similar to what we saw with the summary scores above, and so again, we're seeing a little bit come up with lacks focus, lacks confidence. Again, a 1 is none, so those can be ignored. Eager to please, and so as we click into some of these here, you can see that even the individual recognizes these derailers in some respects, the supervisor as well. And so this gives a little bit more feedback to the story of saying, okay, well, this person sometimes lacks confidence. In this case, lacking focus, and then the other one was eager to please, where maybe they don't want to step on any toes. They don't want to destroy or risk relationships with others, and so they're not pushing people hard enough or holding people accountable enough to really deliver good results.
And the great thing about this is, if you go back to the person's strength, when you're looking at it as a coach, you know that they're trusted, they have high integrity. Those are really high scores. So this is an opportunity to pair something that potentially could derail him with a strength that he or she already has, which is, hey, let me go and ask some people some ideas around these potential derailers, because they're already talking about it.
Yeah.
They already know that, hey, John's going to do this, or Sally's going to do that, or here's where they don't show up really well. So using the high scores to potentially leverage some of these derailers is a really good strategy in helping the person be successful.
Very good point. When you're using or showing the open-ended questions, make sure you randomize those so that they're not in any particular order. So here's the strengths as a leader. This is a great page for someone to read. They'll get some really good feedback here. A lot of times people skip over this page too quickly, and they need to spend some time on it, really understand what's valued or what people value in them as a leader.
As a coach, I will force them.
Yeah.
I will force them to spend about 5 minutes on this page.
Yeah.
And I'll just ask them for themes, and it's very uncomfortable. They typically don't like to talk about their strengths. Like, no, I need to get to something to fix. Well, fix may be leveraging a strength. I mean, if they don't know what they are, they can't repeat it, and they can't do it even more often with greater effectiveness. So really spend some time in looking at the comments that are here and having them acknowledge the strengths that they bring to the table, because that's where they're going to have the greatest success, likely.
Great point. Yeah, because most people will open their report and immediately go to this last page here and try to read through all the negative comments, so to speak. We all have this negativity bias where we want to see what people are saying about us. So, so again, yeah, it's very important to balance that with the positive feedback that they've received. So let me switch back to, we won't go into too much depth here, but using the group results as an HR leader is a really, really advantageous report for you to see, because here you can kind of, there's various ways to display the data, but using your group results, you can kind of rank order participants from lowest to highest scores. This report here, what we're showing is these little lines here show the lowest scoring question to the highest scoring question, and then the average score of these diamonds all the way across. So if you're running 360s for a group of 20 people, and here we've hidden the participant names, most times we'll show them on the group report, you'll know that okay, I'm going to have maybe some difficult conversations with these individuals if they're not aware of some of these things. And then you know that you've got some pretty strong performers up here. This person right here has a pretty low scoring question, even though they have a good score. So there might be some variability in what's going on here in a story to kind of explore. But that gives you some real good direction in what you want to do when you're coaching someone.
A caution that I would offer on this is if you're using this in a group setting, you need to be mindful of the two ends. So if I'm the person that's a 4.5 or a 4.8 and I see this graph up there, it's like, man, I'm at the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah. So don't show this.
Don't show this. And like you know, the other end of the continuum, if I'm at 6.1, it's like, wow, I'm the best of class, and look how good I am. And it's like, do I really need to develop anything? So just be careful with how this chart is used and who it's shared with.
Yeah, most times this is an internal discussion between the leader of that team and HR and how they can kind of develop people and work with them. All right, so this leads into a kind of a discussion about potential coaches. We've touched on this a little bit before in terms of who kind of does the right job, and I'll go through these, and then you can add a lot of commentary here as well. What we find with external coaches is they're a great resource for your executive team, maybe high potentials, even some difficult people that you're working with in the organization. You kind of outsource that. Or if you feel like there's not a good relationship between those in HR that could kind of do the debrief. So external coaches are great. People tend to be more open. They know there's nothing tied back to the organization. It's a confidential conversation. So that works out really well. With most of our clients, we train the HR team to deliver and debrief the 360 results and build that capacity internally. And that's where most of the coaching will happen with most of the leaders in your organization. The boss and the peer are two good options during year 2. So we recommend doing 360s every year. And after everyone's gone through it, everyone's got experience with that coaching meeting they had the first time. And then the boss or a peer can be a good resource to kind of debrief those results during the second year and a good partner for accountability.
Yeah, and the more you become familiar with using 360s in your organization, I've been in organizations where we did all 4 of them. Mm-hmm. And we would connect a senior executive with an external coach, but then we'd also have the internal vice president or director of HR for that division also working very closely with that senior partner. I always got my best feedback on my 360s from a coaching situation from using multiple, mm-hmm. because it just gives me multiple perspectives on how to address an issue or leverage something that I'm looking at. So you remember, a coaching can be used in a couple-minute situation, or it can be over a 6-month period of time. The issue with a coach is being very thoughtful and strategic around how you want to pair them with the individual so they can maximize the outcome.
Yeah, because the idea is that your external coach, you might have multiple touch points throughout the year. With HR, it might be difficult for you to have multiple touch points, but the boss and the peers will have those, and so the consistency really is helpful using those 2 groups. So the other thing that we find are sometimes there's some strong reactions to feedback. Most times there's not, but everyone tends to go through this SARA model when they receive some feedback. And this is taken from the grieving model literature, where when there's a death of a loved one, we kind of go through this experience. Same way when we hear some feedback that doesn't sit well with us. And so there's some energy involved. At first, we feel shocked, and maybe we get angry, and we're resistant to it. Finally, we accept it, and then there's this moment of hope when we see some light at the end of the tunnel, and things can get better.
There's so many funny stories that I've seen when I was running leadership workshops. We'd have periods of time when we'd have 30 people in a workshop, and it's fun to see the reaction. I don't know if fun.
Right. Interesting.
It's interesting because they'd often substitute resistance with revenge. I know who said this, and I'm going to go after them. I've had people literally break down in just crying unconsolably. They fold up their content, and they had to leave for a couple hours.
Wow.
They were, the shock, the anger, but later in the afternoon they came back. They had a period of time to process it, and they got back into acceptance. The key for you in HR is if you're working with somebody is to get them through the cycle to get to hope, because they will want to look for discounting the feedback, but that acceptance and hope is really where they become coachable.
Yeah. And that's the thing. So best practice is we say provide them the report like the day before the coaching session, or if you're going to do a group session there. But you'll need to, as a coach, identify where they are on this model, right? Have they kind of already processed it and they're okay now and ready to talk, or do they still need some time to kind of get through this?
Yep.
So don't force it. The next thing I want to share with you is some research on coaching that we did with an organization. So this was a Fortune 500 company. We surveyed 244 leaders that had gone through a 360 over the past year with them. And this was an organization that had rolled out 360s to all of their leaders around the world. There were probably over 50 HR partners that were participating in coaching and debriefing the results. And so we wanted to see, okay, how did it go this year? How well was the feedback received, and how was the rollout? You know, because there's all these different pieces to the puzzle going on. So some of the questions we asked here are, you know, did you get coaching? Did you set goals? Did your manager follow up with you? And overall, how effective did you think the process was? So two interesting pieces of research. Number one, 94% of those that received coaching and set goals felt that the 360 process was effective. And there's really no surprise there. That's kind of how it should go. And that's really the optimal approach. The sad story was that 34% of those who did not receive sufficient coaching felt that the 360 process was effective. So this was a small minority because most people got sufficient coaching, but those that didn't, only 34% felt that it was an effective process. So if you're not going to coach or debrief people on the results, you're essentially going to be kind of wasting your money on the process for the most part, and maybe leaving people a little bit
irritated.
Yeah, right. It turns into maybe a self-awareness activity, but then that report gets put in the drawer and never looked at again, and they kind of get over it.
But it doesn't become a change initiative of building the capabilities inside of your organization.
Right.
And then the next time you try to go through it, it's like, well, nothing's going to happen again. So you become skeptical, and it just becomes a perpetuating cycle.
Yeah. So the finding here is coach people. You know, give them some feedback or give them someone to talk with about their results.
The other part that I would add to that is I always encourage them to go back, especially to their direct reports, and give them the results.
Yeah.
And ask them
Share
for additional feedback. So whether they get coaching from internal, external HR, they're with generally their direct reports all the time, and if they disclose, hey, I'm working on establishing and creating, you know, work plans.
Yeah.
And it creates just a really easy situation for them to check in, and the person can own the fact that they're working on the 360 rather than saying, well, you know, the organization didn't do anything. So because ultimately it comes down to the individual to own the data, get an action plan that's put in place, and move forward.
Yeah, because the point is, you got feedback from maybe 10 or 15 people. They all spent about 10 or 15 minutes filling out that survey for you. Some people were, you know, really trying to, you know, spend some time deciding on how to rate you or write comments for you. And they want to know that, hey, you got the feedback and you got a message and you appreciated it. Because I invested some time in your development, I'm hoping to see maybe some improvement too.
Yeah, and if you ever want to go through it again, and if you haven't done anything, and you ask those same individuals,
yeah, good luck.
It is very, very common for those scores to actually drop.
Yeah.
And it's surprising how much they will lift by simply going back and saying, here's what you said, here's what I'm working on, and here's the person that I'm working on with my coach. So if you have any other ideas, just the perception that you're also working on your feedback plan and that you're communicating to that others has a great impact on lifting your effectiveness, not just as demonstrated in the scores, but the perception of individuals, oh, yep, they really are becoming a more effective leader because they're looking for that behavior where before they may not have.
Yeah, good point. So here's a good way to roll out results and coach people. Normally, if you're doing a group of people with a 360, you gather them together as a group. You pass out the results, give them some pointers on how to interpret the results and read the report. People aren't sharing their report necessarily in this group setting. You're just showing them how to understand the feedback and really process it. So this is kind of their first exposure to it. And then afterwards, you conduct some individual coaching sessions with them to meet one-on-one and talk about their results. If you're just doing individual sessions, we say deliver the report like a day before, maybe no sooner, because you don't want them to kind of stew over the results for too long before they meet with anyone.
Right.
The discovery meetings are what you're talking about, Dan, in terms of go back, talk to your direct reports, your peers, your boss, find out more, because a lot of times you'll come out with questions from your results that weren't necessarily, they might have been unclear from the initial feedback. Then you finalize your action plan. You share those goals with other people. You follow up with your coach and manager, and then check in with your peers and direct reports. Again, communicating that you got a message, you're working on something. That in and of itself will increase the perception of your leadership effectiveness.
And it really does. The other thing that people really appreciate is following up with them to say, hey, I really valued your feedback.
Yeah.
And here's what I'm working on, which just brings that whole cycle to the conclusion. It's like, oh, this really was helpful and it was valuable, so that the two parties that are involved are benefiting from it as well.
This little model is attached as a white paper in the handout section. I'll also email it to you. It's just a nice little white paper to give to managers to kind of say, here's what we expect you to do after you get your feedback, and a good way to talk to people about it. What you don't want to do is put them on the spot and say, hey, I got your feedback, thank you very much, and then people are thinking, well, you know what I said, what happened, you know, and so
Right.
Well, this is confidential, so there is a way to say it, so we share that with you. A lot of times people want to know, how long does this process take? How much time, should I invest? Like I was mentioned before, it takes a week or two to kind of get raters selected, get your survey set up, especially if you're going to customize it. 2 weeks to administer the survey and collect feedback, and then about a week to kind of get the results together and do all your coaching. If you're going to do this as part of a training program like you were talking about earlier, Dan, we say budget about 8 weeks, because you'll get some hang-ups with people saying, oh, well, I didn't select my raters, or I don't know. Some people get stuck, and so in order to get those reports ready before that training course, start it about 8 weeks early to give yourself some buffer.
Yeah, and there's nothing, if you're doing it as part of a leadership program, there's nothing more frustrating as the participants and as the facilitator. You have a chunk of time in one of those days to go through the feedback, create an action plan, work in some trios, if you will, on processing the information, and the person doesn't have anything to do.
Yeah.
So part of that buffer of time is just making sure that that everybody has a completed 360 as part of the learning experience, whatever that might be, whether it's a leadership program, whether it's a group process, or if they're going through, just one-on-one. They need to complete it, and sufficient time is really important.
Yeah. So again, I'll send you our sample. Well, in the attachments, you'll find these items right now. Expect an email from me as well with the attachments. And for those of you looking to get HRCI and SHRM credit, there in the top left corner, you can see the codes. I'll also email those to you. And if you're looking to get an estimate on what it would cost to run 360s in your organization, just let me know. I can send you a quick quote. Just tell me the number of people involved. We can also provide you, and Dan's more than willing to just talk to you about your current process, what you're doing, if you have any questions or difficulties that you're trying to resolve. He's an expert on this subject, as you can tell.
Yeah, I'd be glad to help. Again, I've been on your side of the fence for the last 25 years, and I have some scars, if you will, of things that didn't go well and
mistakes you made,
mistakes that I've made. But yet, I've had some really great experiences with it as well.
Excellent. Well, Dan, thank you very much, and thanks everyone for attending. Look forward to my email, and we'll look forward to having you join us on a future webinar. Have a great day.